All right, we are going to wrap up this particular portion of the book, of the book itself, when we look at the cerebral cortex itself. And the thing to keep in mind, and the thing that's important when we talk about the cerebral cortex, is the idea that cortex itself, that word, you probably wonder where did that word come from. And cortex simply means bark. And essentially what you're looking at in this cross section here is just up in these areas right here, where that you see is color coded, is what we refer to the cerebral cortex. It's the outer surface of the brain, and it is filled with interconnected glial cells, and that's they're interconnected. And they're neuron cells. So this thin layer is what we refer to as the cerebral cortex. And laid out, they would probably be about the size of a large pizza when we lay it out that way and flatten it all out. The convolutions in the surface of the cortex is such that allows it to be actually crammed in, if you will, the cranium itself. So the actual structure, the structure itself is divided up into 4 lobes, which are pictured here. And the first one, which you see, number 1, is the frontal lobe. And we'll talk about its function in a minute, but the frontal lobe itself, as the name would suggest, is at the area in the front. I know it's a confusing name, of course. So the frontal lobe, it is right behind the forehead. Then the parietal lobe, which runs along the top of our head, and it contains in it a variety of interconnections, which we'll look at when we talk about the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. The temporal lobes themselves, which is that area right up in here, that lie on the side of the near the ears, temporal. You probably are very familiar with the area of your head that people often rub when they have a headache is the temples, and the temporal lobe lies really right behind it. And then finally, the last one is the occipital lobes, which are in the back, largely responsible for sight. It's unlike other parts of our brain, like for temporal lobes, for example, the auditory aspects of it, the auditory nerves and auditory cortex lies right by the center in which it occurs. The frontal lobe is also the case. It oftentimes has executive functions, exec functions. The interesting thing about the occipital lobe is look at how far back it lies on the brain itself compared to what it's connected to in that vision. I would suggest to you that God designed us in such a way that our vision is so vitally important that these lobes were placed in a place where they were the least likely to be affected. And so they are placed a long way away. There are a lot of people that would probably have a different explanation for why the occipital lobes ended up where they are, but at the same time, it is in an area that is highly protected. It's not often that we get a rear damage injury, if you will. We're not often hit directly from from the back. If we're going to have any kind of injury, it's usually a frontal damage type of injury where we hit the front of our head. Now that doesn't mean that the other parts of the brain aren't affected by a frontal damage. The thing to keep in mind here is that the brain itself is suspended in a fluid. All outside of this area out here, it's suspended, which means that if you have a frontal attack or a frontal assault, the brain will lurch forward this way but in hitting the assault, but it'll also go back in this direction. And so we refer to that as a contra-coup injury, and that's often the case in brain injury, is that if there's a frontal, it's called contra-coup injury, and it's not uncommon to see that when somebody is in a motorcycle accident or something like that, where they hit the front of their head, and then there is a corresponding injury in the back of their head because of the brain moving forward and then by impact moving back again. All right, the other two areas that I want to focus on, well, not other two. We've looked at the bigger part of the brain in the lobes perspective. Now I want to focus in on some specific areas that are of interest. Now, before I do, on the last video, I realized that I hadn't spelled the contra-coup injury when somebody gets hit from behind, but it's spelled this way: contra-coup, E-O-U-P, contra-coup. Let me back that. E, so you can actually read it, and it refers to a type of injury that is kind of a front and back type injury because of the movement in the brain inside of the cranium itself. All right, we got that corrected. Now let's look at two specific areas in the parietal lobe. Remember, that's the topmost area of the brain itself. The first one that is part of this is the motor cortex, and the motor cortex is primarily responsible for output. And if you remember, when we talked about neurons that fire together, wire together, and so the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, this is the motor over here, and in the yellow is the sensory, is that they're literally right next to each other, and because of that, then they tend to wire together because they fire together. The sensory cortex brings information in, the motor cortex produces movement as a result of that. So the motor cortex was key, and two researchers by the name of Forster and Penfield actually mapped various areas of the brain that were related to the motor cortex, and they discovered that where precise control was needed, and this is something we will see throughout, is that where precise control, I gotta write it a straight line here, precise control leads to greater cortical area. And to some degree it makes sense. I mean, when more and more brain power is needed to be precise, to be very specific in our movements, then presumably we need more area of the brain to be devoted to manage this precision that's required. Very steady hands, for example, are part of this cortical area. So when we're talking about the motor cortex, it's the output. Forster and Penfield are the key researchers. The other thing to keep in mind is not only this idea of precise control, but also the idea of crossover. So they would stimulate areas of the brain and stimulate on the right side, and it would cross over, the signal would cross over to the left side, and vice versa. And that is one of the key components, if you will, of what happens. The stimulating the different cortical areas is what these guys did, and when they would stimulate, for example, the right hand, it would affect the left areas in the cortex itself, and that's part of the motor cortex and how it operates. The general principle is that it's a left to right principle, if you will, and vice versa, and right to left principle, in terms of, particularly when we actually look at the vision, for example. And these are just key concepts to understand what we're talking about when we talk about the motor cortex and so forth.